Growing up, I was always not playing Halo. In fact, some of my fondest childhood memories were of me not playing Halo. I was too young to be interested in the series, and my sisters didn't care about video games, so I didn't grow up with Master Chief. I grew up with that DreamWorks movie where Matt Damon plays a horse.
Like my father before me.
Of course I knew about Halo though. I mean, at this point in time it was almost impossible not to. Anyone who had an interest in football or high fructose corn syrup would have seen the promos for it, but I never ended up playing the games because I just wasn't old enough to enjoy them. And because the Xbox terrified me. As a kid, I was only scared of two things: the dark and teenagers, and while my childhood friend's house did have an interior lighting system, it also had a 17-year-old who lived in the basement, so the whole place was kind of neutral ground. This was like 2007, so in my mind, all teenagers acted like the guys from Jackass, smoked cigarettes outside the gas station, and played Xbox. While I have no idea if any of that stuff was true about this guy, he did have an Xbox, so he fit the bill. Whenever I was over, I could hear him down in the basement, yelling into his headset at his friends over Xbox Live, playing some game about aliens and infections and various small mammals. The man scared me, and so did Halo. I thought Halo was just an outdated game for people who drank Monster and wore tap-out t-shirts. I was wrong. Thanks to Game Pass and the recommendations from everyone's favorite internet nudist, I recently downloaded and played through Halo 1 through 4, and while I found myself very opinionated about the fourth game, I feel as though I can't do the original trilogy justice if I spread myself so thin. Lucky for you, the internet already seems to have a lot of opinions about the fourth game, so just do some digging. Seriously? That was your takeaway from that game? The Halo franchise began the way all good things do, with a subtitle. Combat Evolved was probably my favorite experience in the Halo trilogy. There was something so incredibly captivating about the game despite its less than thrilling story. The game immediately does a fantastic job establishing its setting and atmosphere with the first level, and like nobody has ever said, things only get better after the crash. I can't write that. The world you find yourself on looks kinda like Earth, but the lack of any life or sounds establishes this familiar and yet unsettling feeling. This is where the game really begins. I played through Combat Evolved on Heroic. I died a lot. And yeah, that's probably because I suck at the game, but I'd also like to think it's because the AI is incredible. Grunts lose morale when their elite is killed. Elites charge you in a desperate suicide run when you stick them with a grenade. Jackals have shields. The enemy lineup is varied enough so that each encounter feels unique and difficult. I find it wildly upsetting that a game old enough to put Joe Biden in office has better AI than 90% of the games being released today. When I died, it wasn't because I was overwhelmed by enemies, it was because I was outsmarted by them. I went into this game completely blind. All I knew going in was that the music was good and that Master Chief had a suit that could take care of his carnal desires, and only one of those proved to be true. I will never forget the feeling of dread I got as I fought the Covenant on Installation 4, only to realize that it wasn't me they were afraid of. 343 Guilty Spark was a masterclass in level design and atmosphere. The next level was none of those things. Prior to this point, the level design had almost been open-ended, allowing the player to approach combat however they desired, so levels like the library drag that to a halt when you're suddenly funneled into a concrete labyrinth hellscape. This doesn't make me feel like I'm an all-powerful super soldier, this makes me feel like I'm drunk and I lost my car in the parking garage. And the finale makes me feel like I found it. You know that thing where you look back at something you loved as a child and have the sudden realization of, oh, this actually isn't that good, and the CGI looks really bad, and I'm definitely talking about the live-action Scooby-Doo movie. Yeah, Halo doesn't have that. Partially because it doesn't have a talking dog in it, but also because the game holds up really well. I can see why people would be nostalgic for this game, and weirdly enough, as I played it, I began to get nostalgic too. Speaking of two, Halo 2 is pretty good. All jokes aside, I actually really enjoyed the Halo 2 campaign. It did a great job acting as an extension of the first game by building upon its framework and adding stuff like post-grunge music. And lizard people. Apparently, this was like a deal breaker for a lot of fans at the time, but I really enjoyed playing as the Arbiter. Maybe it's because Skyrim trained me to like playing as reptilian protagonists with a voice like a car engine, but as I kept playing the game, I realized that I cared more about the Arbiter's story than John H. Christ over here. With the Arbiter, I actually knew what he wanted and grew to sympathize with him as I saw him struggle towards redemption. I have no idea what Master Chief wanted throughout this game. He felt like an empty shell for me to just experience the game through, and I'm pretty sure that's because of 9/11. Hear me out. Combat Evolved released mere months after the towers fell, and Halo 2 didn't come out until 2004, so the game really developed alongside the development of the war in Afghanistan, and it shows. The first game is just your average sci-fi romp that feels more like Star Wars than anything. Halo 2 sees Master Chief literally being deployed to prevent a strategic attack by religious radicals.
Sound familiar?
This was a time when a lot of America felt powerless, so it makes sense that an all-powerful super soldier would act as the gateway through which we experienced the game. Do I think this is why Halo 2 was successful? No, I think it was successful because the game is fun. The AI may not have been as impressive in this game, but the world and the development of the narrative are still just as engaging, so it's hard not to enjoy it. I think Halo is at its peak when you're rushing through a futuristic highway on a warthog or exploring lush foreign environments. And I think it's at its worst when you're on High Charity. I hated this level. I don't know if it's because I marathoned this game and was losing steam, or if it's because every room on this map is populated by silverback gorillas with M320s, but the level really sucked the fun out of the ending for me. Despite this, moments like seeing the Arbiter and Master Chief's long-anticipated meeting and hearing the Chief's final command elevate this game to familiar heights. Halo 2 managed to be a satisfying sequel while getting me excited for the finale too. Speaking of 2, by the time I was ready to play Halo 3, I was completely invested in the series. For some reason, it felt nostalgic, like I had been the 17-year-old in the basement back in 2007. To really get the full experience of being an Xbox gamer, I bought a full-size bag of Doritos and a 2-liter of Mountain Dew, and it worked perfectly. I felt like a real degenerate.
The Cool Ranch pairs really well with the Baja Blast. No!
And I also played the campaign with friends. The Halo 3 campaign had this really awesome feature where one person could play as Master Chief and the other could play as the Arbiter, and seeing the two of these figures fight alongside one another was an absolute blast. The level design in 3 felt so much tighter and neat than it did in like 31% of the Halo 2 levels. A lot of them had branching paths, so even when levels were just linear hallway pushes, you had a bit of freedom in terms of how you approached them. For the first time since Combat Evolved, I felt encouraged to take on enemies the way I wanted to, not the way the game wanted me to. And for the first time since Combat Evolved, I got lost in another concrete corn maze, except this time I got to navigate it twice because the Bungo Boys thought backtracking would be a great addition to the game for some reason. The AI here was a definite upgrade from 2, but for some reason I felt like the enemies were easier to kill. I don't know. It felt less like a fight for my life and more like a massacre tour across the Horn of Africa.
Wait, please don't kill me.
Oh my god.
The story of the game was...
So Kevin, what's going on in this part?
Summarize, there's more going on
this
right
whole
now.
place was built by the
Because
Ark.
then the Ark
Ark
is
so
so
bad
bad
because
Well, it wasn't fantastic.
in the Ark.
I didn't know I was going to be quizzed for this about my Halo lore.
Yeah, I just need to know the Halo lore. The Halo lore, if you will. I'm cutting that. That was bad.
If Combat Evolved was A New Hope, 3 is Return of the Jedi, except instead of indigenous Build-A-Bears, you get Battletoads and gas masks. They even got a cameo from General Grievous. How cool is that? It essentially was the same plot, just done bigger. Crash, fight, drunk drive to safety. The story did make the improvement of actually giving Master Chief a bit of character by having the plot revolve around him trying to rescue his holographic companion Cortana, which acted as the emotional crutch the story needed to get me invested in the game. By now, you had spent 2 games listening to the banter between Chief and Cortana, witnessing the beginning of a beautiful Oedipal complex between the two. The mission where you have to re-enter High Charity to finally locate her is one of the only levels where I felt emotionally driven to complete it, which would have been cool if the level didn't just turn out to be another labyrinth disguised under a thin layer of phallic flesh with intermittent interruptions from D. Bradley Baker. I know at this point in the video it's starting to sound like I really didn't enjoy my time with the Halo series, but I can promise you I did. Saying Halo 2 is the worst in the trilogy is like saying Season 1 is the worst season in Breaking Bad. Like, you aren't wrong, but have you seen what cable TV considers good television? Even when the franchise is at its worst, it is leagues above the rest of gaming, even to this day. Combat Evolved is the most fun I think I've had playing a shooter in years, and again, this is a game old enough to have an OnlyFans account. Playing through these games made me feel nostalgic for a past that I didn't have. It made me miss the days where I would play Infection with friends after my shift at Blockbuster, despite the fact that by 2007, I was still too afraid to walk down the horror movie aisle by myself, let alone fight aliens. I think a lot of this is because Halo is synonymous with the decade I grew up in, and because the decade I grew up in influenced the game so greatly. The similarities between the Halo narrative and the conflict in the Middle East are striking, and even though it's not an event to be remembered fondly, I grew up hearing about the war in Afghanistan on the news, so I associate it with my childhood. Halo somehow manages to perfectly encapsulate the zeitgeist of the 2000s while also being a contributing factor to that zeitgeist itself. I now understand that Halo isn't the outdated shooter for edgy teenagers that I once thought it was, but instead is a masterfully crafted and culturally significant piece of history. I would consider myself to be a Halo fan now, and I can't wait to see what the rest of the series has in store for me.
Never mind, Halo 5 sucks.
Anyone who had an interest in football or high fructose corn me. Anyone who had an interest in football or high fructose corn oh my, I'm done with that line. The AI here was a definite upgrade from 2, but for some reason I felt like the enemies. We're gonna redo that, Chief.